This is the Team Sidelined Podcast, a podcast launched to support the mental game of student athletes during these extraordinary times of COVID-19's impact on life and sport. Brought to you by Sidelined USA. We invite athletes, performance coaches, and resource experts to discuss coping skills, strategies, and mindset work, which have proven to help sidelined athletes face their adversity, build resilience, and forge forward even stronger. And now, here's our host, Executive Director of Sidelined USA, Christine Pinalto.
Today, we're going to talk about the role of personal identity for athletes and how that sense of identity really shapes our motivation, our sense of self-worth, our overall satisfaction in sport and in life, and also just our responses to adversity and the setbacks of life. I just finished recording this episode, and I'm really pumped about getting this conversation started. So I'm keeping the intro short so we can get right to it. This episode had a ton for you to chew on. I encourage you to listen to this episode with an open mind and really ask yourself some of those deeper questions about where you base your personal identity and how that's impacting you. Thanks for joining us today. Let's get started.
And now, Game 7, Identity Check, how athletic identity shapes our response to setbacks. Featuring former athlete, now researcher and licensed therapist, Dr. Ben Holtberg. Neither Sidelined USA nor its affiliates provide clinical or medical care of any kind via their relationship with Sidelined. At no time should a user have an expectation of clinical care or professional services offered or rendered.
Thank you so much for being a part of this today. I'm really excited about this conversation. I've listened to other trainings that you've done online and have been really interested in hearing your take on all of these things and bringing your voice to this topic for our audience, because this is such an important topic for athletes in general, but specifically right now, so many more athletes, because the pandemic impacts certainly our normal work with athletes who experience a medical disqualification. But so many more are being impacted or have had to kind of contend with this topic this past year. So thanks so much for being here today with us. Appreciate that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited. I love what you're doing, and I think it's so critical, and it's so needed. I think there's so many people that don't know what to do when they face this challenge of not being able to participate in the thing that they love, and that's that. I've experienced that, and I know that. And so I was really excited that you contacted me.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah. Along those lines, tell us a little bit more about, who you are, and, your participation in athletics, and then what you're doing currently.
Yeah. So I grew up in the Midwest pretty much, and sports was just a huge part of my life. I mean, from the time I was young, it was just something that we did. And I think I played every sport, possible, at least for a Midwest boy. So I played basketball and football and ran track and ran cross country. And I think I even tried my hand at golf and other things that I wasn't very good at. But early on in my life, I just realized that I could run faster and longer than a lot of people. And there was something inside of me that just loved to push the limits of how far I could go. And so it was really in pretty much my life. And throughout high school, I played basketball and ran track and ran cross country. And then I went on to run college track at Division I level. And at Oral Roberts University, and really, I went through a lot of challenge in college. My freshman year, I got my first stress fracture, and that moment was a big deal for me as a freshman to go in and be excited to prove myself, and at that level, and also deal with the fear of it, and my identity was kind of lost in that moment of like, well, what who am I then if I'm not an athlete? And academics honestly wasn't a big focus of mine. I just wasn't something that I really put much of my identity into at that time. And so throughout my college career, just to make a long story short, I think I had 8 stress fractures. I had some significant pain in my back throughout that time where we couldn't really diagnose it. But I still was able to go to the NCAA championship several times and run there, and still was able to be quite successful and then be able to run after college for several years and make the U.S. championships and U.S. Open and battled injuries throughout that whole time until really I had to make a decision to decide that I needed to kind of step away. And so at that time, I was really moving into what I became really passionate about in psychology and got my master's as a therapist, marriage and family therapist, and was working with kids and youth growing up in very difficult circumstances and really shifted my whole focus to that. And so, and then I went on to get my PhD in studying the stress impact on the body, especially emotional health and emotionality. And then started doing work with elite athletes and elite programs, looking at some of these kind of emotional resilience ideas and what that means. And then was a professor, a teacher, went the tenure route. And my last job was at USC, where I was the director of research there and doing a lot of work with their athletic and still continue to do some work with their athletic department, as well as other sports and companies. I recently made a move out of academia altogether to a nonprofit called Search Institute, where I'm now the vice president of research and practice. And we partner with organizations to help promote youth thriving for all youth and advance equity. And so that's been a very meaningful transition for me, as well as thinking about, how science can work really closely with organizations, with people to improve people's lives. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you've definitely had a ton of experience, both as an athlete as well as a professional, working with athletes who, dealing with this idea of building your identity and like high performance, impact, but also not letting it get to the point where it defines your sense of self-worth. And I know we're going to get into more of that throughout this discussion. So thanks for sharing all of that and for investing in our athletes and our audience today. So let's go right to it here. A lot of athletes out there may be struggling right now, certainly with uncertainty about their athletic goals. Maybe they've been impacted by that pandemic. Maybe they've been impacted by a career-ending injury or just an uncertainty about whether this is going to, down the road, impact what's possible for them. So talk to us a little bit about an athlete's identity and how that can play a larger role as in how they process like setbacks or even roadblocks, because some of these are perceived setbacks or anticipated setbacks. Some of them are real setbacks, like right now setbacks. Yep. And some of them are flat out roadblocks. For the spring seniors last year, that was it, unless they were playing college and got that extra year of eligibility. But a lot of athletes did have some serious impact already due to the pandemic. So how do we process athletic identity with our setbacks and roadblocks? Yeah,
when I think the normal trajectory for anybody who really falls in love with sports and enjoys competing and playing sports is that we can tend to begin to build our sense of identity around that particular thing. And so for sports in particular, you have the performance side of it. And so often what happens even as a young kid is we're beginning to understand who we are and what we can contribute to the world. And when we get that feedback from the people around us that really highlights, oh, that was a great race or that was a great performance, and your friends kind of notice you for it, and it feels good to be a part of a team. And there's nothing wrong with all of those things, because that's one of the beauties of sports is you feel connected to your teammates. And by far the biggest thing I took away from sports is the relationships I built. And I still have those relationships in my life. But where it gets a little bit tricky for us is when our identity gets so wrapped into how we perform in sports that when we don't perform well, we feel really bad about ourselves. Or two, when we get injured or we experience adversity, we can start to do negative things to try to motivate ourselves to get back into that sport. For me, that's where identity gets problematic for athletes is when we begin to not just base our part of our identity on who we are as an athlete, we start to base our identity on how we perform and our results. And that's what, I started to study and understand more at a deep level, is this idea of performance-based identity, is when we put our value and worth as human beings in the results of some sort of competition or event, whether it's as a student, you could talk about the ACT, SAT, what college you get into. For an athlete, it could be a time or win losses or performance in a certain competition. That's where we start to have a reaction that impacts us emotionally. And so this performance-based identity really undermines our ability to bounce back, to be resilient, because we actually tend to shrink back or come up with excuses or shame ourselves or disengage altogether. And so it's not a healthy way. It might work for a little while for people to have fear that really helps them get up in the morning to work out or do something. But over the long haul, it wreaks havoc on our body, and it actually really is connected to stress hormones. And so I could kind of go into some of the detail of why that is, but that's probably the biggest discovery of my work and research, was really looking at this how we form our sense of identity and how we form meaning in our life, that really is a driver of our emotional health to deal with adversity and challenge.
Right. And that is huge, because it's something that happens so subtly, I feel like, as we're, achieving things and we're setting goals and we're going after dreams and breaking those goals and dreams down into, like, what do I need to accomplish today or this week or this month, and building all of those things into our drive forward. And it's so easy to forget about some of those internal motivations, or to not even just think more significantly about what all the whys behind what we're doing, and making sure that we keep things in balance. So I think this is going to be a really interesting topic to talk about for this discussion groups afterwards, when we give those discussion questions and get athletes talking about identity, because I think it'll be a real eye opener. So let's talk a little bit about a healthy athletic identity, because we're not talking about like athletic identity being a bad thing. It's a great thing. But what does a healthy identity look like for an athlete? Like, what's the determining factor between the two different kinds of identities?
Yeah, so I think, even starting a little bit more broad, when we think about identity is really about how we see ourselves, so who we are, and how we see ourselves, or where we fit in the world. So both of those really become important. And identity is also important in the sense, if you think about it, I often talk about a narrative identity, because and other researchers have really laid this foundation, but a narrative identity is interesting, because that's your self story. So we tell stories about ourselves, and those come often from the people around us that are the closest to us. Like, they might say, Ben, you're a competitor, or you have grit, or you're not good at math, or you're not this, or you're this. But over time, we can start to internalize those voices as if they're our own. And so we often will really create our story around what people have, the messages in our environment, but also kind of the experiences we have. So I think that's really important, because we can revise that story. And that's the hope, is like, when you start to be able to recognize what you formed your sense of identity and your story around, then you can start to say, yeah, but is this the story I want to create for my life, especially as a young person? So the unhealthy part about narrative identity, or this kind of our self-concept when it comes to an athlete, is when our narrative identity is constrained only, like, we're starting to tell this very thin story about ourselves. And that thin story is only about sports. My identity is as an athlete, and that's it. It's not multidimensional. It doesn't have to do with my culture. It doesn't have to do with my character strengths or things that I can offer to the world. It doesn't have to do with even the type of student I am, or the brother, or the sister, or the partner. It really gets so constrained to that thin story, which then really increases the stakes of how we perform in that. And so when our self identity is at stake in any situation, physiologically, we begin to be on alert. We begin to be defensive. We begin to really try not to look bad, or to we will do almost anything to save that sense of self story. Why that's important is because an unhealthy identity is really when we begin to really form everything about who we are around one domain, like sports, but in particular, even focusing deeper on the results of it, and not on the process of it. So a healthy athlete identity usually it works alongside, there's a harmonious passion to it where it works alongside other parts of our lives. Relationships are still important. So I'm not just out for myself on a team sport. I also look out for my teammates, because I can do that when I have a fuller story of myself that's not constricted to just, it is so important that I perform well, and it's about me, and it's my narrow view doesn't allow me to see all the things I can do for my community or the people around me. So a healthier sense is when we start to say, well, what is really meaningful to me? Like when I strip away all of it is about sports down to why do I love it? Like, what is it? And I'll do this with professional athletes all the time that I work with. Well, I have them do a kind of a mindful activity and imagine themselves back when they first fell in love with sports. Like, what was that moment where you just got pure joy out of what you were doing? And then we'll create the whole scenario of what did it feel like? What were the senses around you? And thinking about, like, I think about being either one on the basketball court at the little elementary school down the street from my house and playing all day and just loving it. And you're competing hard and you're loving it. But what happens when you get a identity that's based in performance alone, or even in just single domain, what can happen then is that we lose the joy, and the gift of the sport becomes more of a burden. And it also doesn't allow us to navigate things that are out of our control. Because if we get injured, well, I put everything into this as an athlete. This is all who I am. I don't have anything else to offer the world. And that's leads to really even traumatic type of transitions for people, where they really go deep down that dark hole of depression and anxiety. And I've been there. I've experienced that, where I was curled up in a ball after a race at the US Open, and I had put so much time and money, and I was in the best shape of my life, and I didn't perform well. And I remember going back and sitting on that hotel floor all alone. Nobody was there with me, and just crying and just really going into that shame place for me, because a big part of who I was at that moment was all about sports. And I had felt like nobody would even care about me if I don't perform, if I don't do that. And so that's the other factor you see, is people begin to put relationships around that. They constrict it to just sports. And it really is it's unfortunate, because there's so many things to broaden a young person's world beyond sports that can actually make them a better athlete, or to be able to perform more free and with joy. And that really is helping young people find more of a sense of purpose and meaning in their life, where they are living according to their sense of these things that are really important to them at the core. They sometimes take some work to get athletes too, but once they get there and they can start to think about this more identity around purpose and meaning in my life, and that can be part of it is sports, of course, because there's I love sports still to this day, but there's something bigger there driving the motivation than trying to prove your self-worth. It's actually more of an expression of all your hard work and your dedication and your commitment, not a definition of who you are. Those are two very different ways of looking at identity when it comes to being an athlete.
Right. Yeah, we love that idea of being, more than an athlete, and reminding ourselves about, like, we are made for more, and that is part of what we do, but that's not who we are. Mm-hmm. We talk about that a lot. It's certainly challenging in today's athletic culture, let's just say, because there's so much required of athletes. It's, multiple hours a day, 6 days a week, maybe 7 days a week, year round. And so sometimes that leaves little time for developing other aspects of ourselves. And so maybe we just would knowing that we can't change the sports schedules and things like that. Maybe if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, how would I even develop anything outside of, fill in the blank, your sport, because I don't have time literally to do that, anything else besides, getting my homework done. Maybe just starting with the exercise of reflecting on this and working on it on an internal level of like, how do I make sure that I'm thinking about myself as I can contribute in other ways, just relationally, or, maybe it's academically, or maybe, someday there'll maybe be a chance for you to, work out more time for those things. But maybe if you just think about, if I did have more time, like what would I be interested in doing, and maybe build in pockets here and there to explore some of those things. But just knowing that when you do have more time, whenever that is, you will be able to already know some of the things that you're interested in and can pursue. So that's just kind of an aside there, because I know that's a huge challenge for athletes to feel like they have no time for anything else. But let's go back to performance-based identity for a little bit, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about that healthy identity again. But as we're thinking about performance-based identity and trying to figure out, like, those who are listening, if this applies to them, if they've experienced this developing kind of a more singular identity or a performance-based identity in some ways, what would it look like in this last year during the pandemic for an athlete who was had a performance-based identity? Like, finish this sentence. You might have a high performance-based identity if you, what are some of the markers?
Well, I think that the broader markers that maybe are not COVID related, but certainly would apply. So I'll start with those two first, and then I'll come back to the COVID question, because there is something really important there I would love to touch on. But you read the statement one more time for me too.
Sure. You might have a high performance-based identity if you fill in the blank.
If you fear failure more than get excited about the opportunity to test yourself, to see where you are. It's also if you are worried how other people will think of you if you do not perform well. If you try to think of ways to justify a poor performance before you even get in the competition. So this is often people who might start coming up with all of those excuses as a safety, because it's scary that if I don't perform, then at least I have a reason. So it might be that you're sick, or your workouts didn't go well, or whatever that is. But it often is our way to set us up for being able to deal with loss or not being able to perform well. The other thing is, if you feel better about yourself only when you do perform well. If when you don't perform well, it's really hard for you to bounce back, and you're not able to really learn from that failure, because it eats at you so much, and it can drive you to work harder, but it doesn't. You can't see the opportunity for the growth. So you're focused more on that result than you are on the process of growth for yourself. If you often cut off relationships around you that you care about because you don't have time for them because you want to focus so much. If you try to over control every aspect of your life so that you don't make mistakes. And so you often will set a schedule for yourself in a way that doesn't allow for you to enjoy other things about life that really bring us the sustainable motivation that we need. I don't know how far you want me to go, but I feel like I could go all day.
That's
now.
Great.
I'm
like checking off the list. I'm like, yep, that's me. I'm sure a lot of other people are listening, doing the same. And then touching on COVID, during this COVID time, like, is there any additional markers? Like, how would that look if we're cut off from those sports and activities?
Yeah, with COVID in particular, I think one really big way to know this is if you're not motivated to keep doing the sport or working out, because there's not the competition part of it or the performance part of it. Now, performance is the fun part. Like I know I would miss it deeply if this happened during my senior year. But I do think there's people who, when that adversity hit, they withdrew and they disengaged and they distracted themselves in unhealthy ways. And so that's one way that I would notice with COVID on a performance-based identity. If you're just really kind of falling into a state of not feeling good about yourself because there's not an opportunity for you to shine, if you kind of crave that limelight, which again can be a normal thing too, but if that is the source of your motivation, then it's not sustainable through adversity and challenge. But it is tricky with COVID because I think we're all, everybody, whether you're an athlete or not, there's this high level of burnout in whatever you're doing. And so there's got to be, it's really hard to figure out, because when now that it's been a long-term effect, performance-based identity person could have also done the opposite and really said, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to push myself harder, but to unhealthy, links. And I think that goes back to some of those other warning signs. If it really is coming at the cost of your emotional health, then that's a problem. If it's not an outlet for your emotional health, but it's more of it's starting to really hurt your self-esteem and your self-worth. And so those are all things. And if you can't really reappraise situations and say, okay, well, this is a challenge, but this is also an opportunity for growth. Or even sometimes, let's be honest, sometimes we just have to survive, the day at times. And so instead of really like thriving, just getting up that morning and doing something. So I think the self-compassion piece is really important for people. If you can't have self-compassion for yourself in this moment, then it's probably going to be hard for you to have it in any moment.
Right. That's really true. And it's been quite the season for that, because there's so much adjusted expectations we've had to make because so much is out of our hands. So that's super relatable. I'm thinking about athletes who are high performing. I mean, like that's a typical personality type for an athlete, yep. Right? So what's the difference between a high performance mentality, which is really significant and important to be an elite athlete, and that performance-based identity? Like, where does it go wrong?
Yeah. It both from the research I've done and the people I've worked with, you see that type of athlete where it's a high performer and their identity and their worth is so wrapped up in their performance that it drives them on the day-to-day, and they do excel. They often do excel for a while. But what also happens with these athletes that I've found is there's a shadow side to that. So that pursuit of excellence is really costing them their emotional, psychological, and relational health. Take Michael Phelps as a great example of this, the most decorated athlete in modern history, really in history, but particularly in modern history of the Olympics, who experienced depression and suicidal thoughts. And he has so many quotes that he talks about, but he says in one, I had no self-love, I had no self-worth, I'm just a swimmer. And for him, who he's not just a swimmer. I mean, in a lot of ways, he is a hero and a god for a lot of people in the swimming world because of his performance. But the shadow side of that was really underneath that was depression, anxiety, and really almost cost him his life in a lot of ways. And that story is one that is of somebody who was also incredibly gifted and talented and hard worker as well. But there's lots of stories of people with high levels of talent that could have been really great, but along the process, the journey really ate them up so that they could never perform at their best. And that loss, I've seen that. That's one of the biggest tragedies, I think, of working with youth, is when somebody with so much potential to offer so much to this world has either their life cut short or somehow has their potential cut short. So those athletes that are really driven that way, we can often lift them up, and a coach might say, I wish I had whatever that kid had. I wish I could bottle it up and give it to everybody on my team. but it's what's behind the motivation that matters the most. So the difference is those athletes who have a good sense of purpose or meaning, that they understand who they are, what they value, they pursue it with just as much vigor to accomplish goals and to be the best version that they can be. But they also have a connection to something bigger than themselves. They're not self-focused. They are able to really see the connection to something bigger, whether that's their team or whether that's for a connection to their family members, or whether that's a connection to God, or whatever that is. There's something there that is behind their pursuit that is more sustainable. It's a sustainable fuel instead of one that will really burn you out very quickly, like the performance-based one. In my studies, I found that there's no difference in level of performance for these two athletes and their mindsets. The difference is in their emotional health. And in our data set, we found that actually the ones with the performance-based identity got to the Olympics more often, but the ones with the purpose-based identity actually got the medal more often. And so there's something very interesting about that we have to understand more. But the point is that if we don't go back to those foundations of who we are, because it gives us a bigger perspective about the world and how sports fits in that perspective, but it doesn't diminish the importance of giving everything you have, of working hard, to putting it all out there and really laying it on the line without the fear that this is going to define who I am. And there's a freedom that happens when we can really have a strong foundation of who we are outside of just sports that allows us to do that. It allows us to just go and put ourselves fully present in the moment without the fear of results. And so that's where fear can be a double-edged sword. It might drive you to work harder, but it's going to be the same thing that motivates you in the moment that also doesn't allow you to put it all out there. So it inhibits performance in a lot of ways too.
That is fascinating. I mean, it's so counterintuitive in some ways, because we think we have to focus on the performance, because that's what the Michael Phelps of the world would do, be completely singular in their thinking, and when they get up in the morning, when they go to bed at night. But what you're saying is, more often than not, even though those athletes do make it to the high levels, more often than not, those that are the most successful are those who actually have that purpose-based identity and have things in perspective in that way. So talk a little bit about this role of purpose-based identity and how that helps dismantle some of the unhealthy habits that we form when we have created more of a performance-based identity.
Yeah, and I really more and more see it as kind of a continuum of, like, we all have performance-based identity. And so for me, I know when I'm falling back into some of those old habits, just based on, really having awareness when physiologically I feel this kind of insecurity or this like moment of like, just being in kind of in a funk and treating people in a negative way or whatever it is. And I know I need to be aware of it and change it and move more towards the spectrum of the purpose-based identity. And so I think self-awareness of really the ways that we really do things is a really first important step to moving yourself on this continuum. There's four, it's probably helpful to say this, there's four main coping strategies that are often associated with performance-based identity as well. And we all do them, and we all do them at different levels. But there's those people who, when they have a high performance-based identity, their worth and values based on how they perform, when they don't perform, their go-to is the shame, right? It's the negative self-talk. It's speaking to yourself in a way you would never speak to loved ones or anybody around you. Because you think, if I just put myself down enough, it's kind of like even the coach's approach to say, I want you to soak this loss in right now. I want you to feel the pain of this loss so that you never want to do it again. Well, that's really not a healthy way to motivate. It's really a shame-based, but we often do that ourselves. So some of the athletes performance-based identity is shame. The other one's blame. So this is the athlete who often puts it on everybody else. It's the referee, it's the coach, it's the injury, it's everything, because it's safer to blame it outward than it is to take responsibility for your own growth. So shame and blame often go together when we talk about performance-based identity. Then you have control and withdrawal, or creating chaos even. So shame, blame, control, and then withdrawal. Control is really you don't perform well, so now I'm going to take control of everything in my life. I'm going to cut people out that were distractions. I'm just going to do better at my diet, my nutrition. I'm going to have every inch of my life mapped out. And if you don't fit into that map, then I can't have you in my life. Well, that's not sustainable either. And then the opposite of that is the people who just really withdraw. They pull back, they disengage. They might want to numb themselves in some way through whatever feels good to forget about it in that moment. Now, these often come in pairs. And so people often will shame and control, or blame and withdraw, and we all do it. I've done all four of those things. But when you can become aware of that behavior, then it starts to say, there must be something about this that triggered my performance-based identity. And that first step of naming it out loud often and to people around you can really be powerful than to replace it with something else. And so if we shift it now to this purpose-based identity, it really becomes more about thinking about, one, what do I value? Like when I ask people, what is the most important things in your life? Or I ask them, like, what do you care about most in your life? Or what is a value you have? Most people will say things like family. They'll say things like, connection, or helping people, or really getting down to those things that are more sustainable. And so that's a first important step, is to say, what do I really value? And I really want to be about it. I really want to structure my life around those things. And so it begins to combat some of those self-focused performance-based identity things. And so when we start to develop that sense of purpose and meaning in our life through living into our values more, it does give us more of a foundation to have healthy responses to things that we can say, all right, instead of shaming myself, I'm going to take care of myself, because I know that I need to do some self-care. I might need a rest day. I mean, I think at least 6 of my 8 stress factors came because I didn't know how to take a rest day. I just wanted to push because I was trying to prove something to everybody around me and to myself that ended up undermining my ability. But if I was operating in a healthier place, I would step back and say, I need to take care of myself right now and have healthy boundaries, or whatever it is. And instead of blaming people, we actually can take responsibility, and we can actually understand and be grateful for people around us. And we're not so self-focused. Instead of controlling, sometimes we have to surrender. Sometimes we have to say, I can't control everything, but I can do this. And you're able to actually release some control, and you can trust people on your team. You can trust people in your life. And then instead of withdrawing, we stay engaged, and we're able to really work through difficult times. Those are the teammates. Those are the people you want around you. And those are that's where the level of performance increases, especially in team sports, but also in individual sports. When you have a whole team full of performance-based identity people, it's all cutthroat, and it might work for a while, but when push comes to shove, they're going to turn inward and not really unite together, versus this kind of, we all share this common purpose. There's something bigger than ourselves. And that's where magic happens. That's where people perform, their performance is elevated, in a lot of ways. And so that continuum is really important for us to know, and kind of the difference between those two.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think your thoughts about just purpose and finding, I mentioned a couple of things when it came to a purpose-based identity that caught my attention. And one was really thinking through what you value, and really thinking through what you find meaningful, which can be hard because they're kind of more abstract concepts. Maybe we haven't really taken the time to sit down and think about. Do you have any tips? We're talking about, high school and college athletes right now. Like, we're talking about an age in life where it's hard to think about like, what's my life purpose? Or it seems very abstract. So do you have any tips for young people in helping develop that and take it out of the realm of like lofty psychological blah, blah, blah to practical, like thinking through, maybe journaling out some responses to help get some traction in this space?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's really important. Purpose can really have this feeling of like, oh, well, how am I supposed to find my life purpose? And there's all kinds of like culture understandings of purpose. First, I'd say you can have multiple purposes in your life. I'm not talking about finding your ultimate purpose. That's a lot to take in as a high schooler, and well, even for us in our life. My purpose as a father is different than my purpose at work with other people in my life. There might be some strands that connect, but that sense of purpose I have in my work, and that sense of purpose I have as a father or as a partner or whatever it is, there can be multiple things, and we can find what purpose can do when we start to make it a practice in our life is it can make the mundane meaningful. So instead of like, let's say in practice, instead of when you have a sense of purpose, when you see someone struggling and you see someone having a difficult time, making the mundane meaningful is to go over to that person and speak encouraging words to them in that moment. It's being able to take a small moment to really lift them up, and that's beginning to live in a value or a sense of purpose that's bigger than yourself. It's instead of it can be really hard in high school, and I remember this of like, how does that geometry test really relate to my sense of purpose and meaning in my life? But it's being able to connect the long view there of saying, like, maybe I don't even like this topic, or I don't even want to do this work, but I can see the long view of who I want to become. And so I'm going to put in the work for this, or I'm going to do what I need to do for this. And so it's beginning to really on a daily basis take note of the mundane things that we do and finding deeper meanings in those moments. Instead of complaining about taking the trash out, being able to reframe that and say, you know what? Yeah, this sucks, but I'm going to take the trash out because I know this makes a contribution to my family. I know this is important, that I'm doing something for my family. I know it sounds hard for a high school kid to do that, but it will transform your life. Like when you start to really be able to look at situations from a different angle, that starts to give you really, you're training your mind. And we often don't train our mind. We often think I can train my body. I can train a skill and learn a skill, but our mind is the thing that even if we can use that as a practice for training our mind, that when you're waiting in Starbucks line, to be able to say, instead of going down that rabbit hole, this is taking forever, why are they doing? Starting to say, this is an opportunity for me to learn how to be more patient. And I'm going to sit here, or I'm going to say hi to somebody who's having a bad day. And in college too, it's the same way. Like, what can I do? What's one thing I can do today for somebody else without them asking for it? How can I spot it? Can I walk out my front door and smile at that person or say hi to that person? That's starting to live day to day with purpose and meaning. So the first thing is really making mundane moments more meaningful in our lives. The other thing that I think we have to do with it is really what I do often is I do this on Monday when I even think about my goals for the week. I really go back to my values of like, okay, so the one way to do this is just to draw kind of a straight line on a piece of paper, and on this side, really write down those values, things that you really say you're about, that you value, whether that's friendships, whether that's family, whether that's hard work, whatever it is. And then think about on a daily basis, how often are you doing those things? And so if you just kind of report on those things, if you just have a piece of paper next to you, like when do you feel most joy, most alive, most excited? Most of the time it has when our values are lining up with whatever we're doing. That's where flow comes from. It's something that's really important for us. We're engaged in it fully and we're present in it. And so the first step often is really for us to map out what is important to you. And it can be helpful to say, okay, what's one thing at my, like what's a representation of something that's meaningful in my family? We'll do this thing where we'll have people bring pictures in, or some sort of symbol to represent what's something important to them and their family. And you start to see these things emerge of like, oh yeah, that is really, relationships is critical for me, or our family is really important. Loyalty is really important. Whatever it is, to being a good friend, being a good teammate, all of those kinds of things. And then is your behavior reflecting that on a day-to-day basis? And when we can start to recognize and build our day around certain things, that starts to develop some habits. And so it's one thing to create a narrative identity around purpose, but it also requires us to create the habits that match that. So without the habits, it's just a good idea. You can just feel good about yourself and be in a sense of purpose, but you have to create the daily habits or the ways of doing things that match that. And that's where the power is.
That is really good. And I feel like I want to just think through that some more for myself. I think that's so helpful to think about your values, needing to identify them first of all, and probably don't need a list of 20. We probably should focus on a handful, I'm guessing. What would you say?
Absolutely. I'd say even start with the core 3 to 5.
Okay. That's helpful. So like distilling everything down to like 3 to 5 values that we have, and then working and ensuring that in our week, we're building in the things that are going to build up those values and help grow us as people, which I think is such an interesting take on something that we talk about at Sideline USA a lot, which is if you're cut off, for those of us who get cut off from athletics because of a career-ending injury, that's who we normally work with at Sideline USA, is either an injury or health condition or what have you, that they're permanently blocked off from sports. And one of the things that we talk about in identity and that loss of identity is taking a look at sports and really thinking about your sports participation and asking yourself, what is it that you really loved about your sport? And what was that exactly? Was it the competitive drive? Was it the teamwork aspect? Was it being a part of something bigger than yourself? Was it just challenging your own self and your own, kind of overcoming goals? And, those are all incredible qualities that you can now transfer to other aspects of your life and and that also ties back to the idea of seeing yourself as more than an athlete. Right. The sport is just the mechanism for you to really grow right now in all of those things and to build these values. But the arena of life is where you're going to continue to grow and develop and be able to just play out those values and play out those character qualities that make you. So it really brings, that's purpose, is when we're seeing it's not about, football. It's not about hockey. It's not about cross country. It's about who you're becoming. And that's just the way that you're showcasing that right now. So
yeah. And I think that is right on. And I'll just say, I think the most powerful motivation in the world is when pain gets transformed to purpose. And that's no easy task, right? Like if you experience pain of loss, of losing, not being able to compete in something that you love, but you can transform that in meaningful ways and find meaning in this really bad, adverse situation. And you could do that in a way that transforms it to now helping others, to being involved in something else, to giving back in a way from your learned experience. That really is the most powerful motivator in the world. That's where you see people doing incredible things because they've experienced what that means and walking through something in a painful way. And it becomes really critical for them now to help others navigate it in a new way. And that motivation, when coming from a sense of purpose, is really, I think, what you're talking about. Then you can see those values transferring to a different domain, to a different area. And so I think that's absolutely true. I mean, if you even just look at people who have made huge differences in our society, most of them, it came from pain being transformed to purpose.
Right. And 9 times out of 10, most of us would choose the non-pain route, right? I mean, that's human nature. But if you just step back for a second and realize that all the really incredible stories even the sports stories out there have to do with overcoming adversity. And sometimes that's a double-edged sword, because maybe your setback is more of a roadblock. Like you literally cannot keep pursuing your dream because you have, let's say you have 3 ACL tears and there's just no way that you're going to be able to be the same athlete. It's kind of over at that point. And for that particular athlete, we have to be able to see our setbacks and even our roadblocks in a bigger perspective as just part of our journey, as part of our story, and that there's different ways to redeem those pain points. It's not always going to look like you make your comeback story and you get to have your athletic dream that you wanted, and it's the poster story, it's the Olympic feature story. Sometimes that rising above, so to speak, or that the comeback story is a totally different kind of comeback story.
That's right.
And sometimes we focus only on the one comeback story of achieving the original dream, but there's this other way of a shifting of a dream, or like getting into psychology when you maybe didn't even know you were interested in that because of your own personal experience. Not sure if that was your situation.
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome. All right. This has been really, really awesome. I've got one more question for you as we wrap up and thinking about all of these things. And particularly, I'm thinking of the athletes who've been effectively pushed out of sport due to the pandemic, or maybe it's because of an injury or what have you, but they didn't get to play out their sports journey, their sports career the way they wanted to. Maybe they got to play in their season, but it was a literally 4-week season or even a 2-week season. And some of the teams out there are really doing their entire season in 2 weeks worth of time, and then it's championships. And it's like, that just doesn't feel the same. So what do you say to all the athletes out there who are kind of living with this level of, I don't know if it's like post-trauma when it comes to like this massive disappointment and letdown of what this year has been, but certainly there's a lot of layers of disappointment and like the shoulda, woulda, coulda. So any thoughts for them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say the first thing that I would say is like, that pain is real. Like that it's nothing to be ashamed of if you experience that as a real loss in your life. And there's grief to that loss, and grief is something that when you experience something that's really important to you that's gone, and we often, it's not explainable. It's not, when we go through grief, it's not as clean as what a lot of people have talked about as this 5 stages. It's actually very complex, where we might think about it a lot sometimes and it'd be painful, and then we might pull back and still experience good moments and things that are fun, and then we might feel the pain again. But the first thing I'd say is let yourself grieve, reach out, recognize it as grief, is that this is a major loss, and no amount of positive talk about that right now is going to really move you out of that. Like if you move on too quickly without that grief part of it, then it's just superficial. So the first thing I would say is we need to acknowledge the pain that you've experienced, that we need to acknowledge this is very painful. This was a very meaningful thing. And if your career is done for good, whether that's for an injury or COVID, and you played your last game, or you didn't get to play your last game, but it's done. Or even if you're continuing on in some way, but the point is that that chapter of your life, it's okay to grieve. So there's no right way to feel about it, and you give yourself permission to feel about it. Give yourself safe space to do that. Make sure you have support around you, and you're reaching out to people that love you and care about you, not because of your performance, but because who you are and what you have to offer this world. That's the first thing I would say is allow yourself to grieve. And then as you go through that process, you have to come to a place where you say, okay, but what can I learn from this experience, and what's most important to me and in life? And anytime we experience loss, there is this opportunity for us to really evaluate what's most important, and I've had significant loss in my life, and especially over this period of time. And for me, it really it's grief, but it's also, I hold on to those things that are dear to me more tightly, of expressing love to my kids and my friends and my family, and recognizing that some things are out of our control that can happen. So we really have to live presently in the moment. So allowing yourself to grieve, but then beginning to move to this place of transitioning to what you value, what can this teach you about what's most important to you, and then building up that hope for the future. And hope really is about it's not just an optimistic view of the future that's not realistic. Hope is beginning to think about the pathways of getting there, and really understanding what you learned in that sport can really transfer to getting to a new meaningful pathway. And I know it's hard to hear right now. I think if anybody said it to me in the middle of my injuries or my pain, I'd be like, okay, whatever. But life there's something great for you, that each one of you have something, a unique purpose, that the world needs you right now, that you have something to offer. And that's not dependent on how fast you run, how fast you throw a ball or hit a ball or whatever it is that's what you do, that there's something unique that's drawing you towards, that you're going to find when you allow yourself to seek it. And life will get better. There's going to be pain, that's for sure, but that's life. And so how do you find that hope in that moment and recognize your unique purpose for this world? And the last thing I'll say is that you are enough. You don't need that result, that who you are is enough. And you don't have to have sports to prove that, and start from there and begin to explore what's next for you, because then we can turn to this hopeful future. What can I do now that I couldn't do before because of some of the things in sports? I didn't snowboard for the first time until my 30s, and I fell in love with it, but I could never do it as an athlete. My coach would have killed me, and my sponsors and everybody else. But what's out there in the world to explore still that you just haven't done yet? What are the opportunities? And so that's kind of that process. You don't have to go there too quickly, because then it's just superficial, but you go through that process of pain and grieving, giving your permission to do that, then finding some hope and some sense of excitement for the future, and then expanding the possibilities of saying, oh, wow, like this world, there's lots of things I can do. And so those are the things that I would kind of suggest in this moment for those who are feeling that loss right now.
That's tremendous. Thank you so much for that. There's so many incredible thoughts in this episode. I'm really excited for all of our listeners to be able to kind of take this and chew on it. Might have to listen to this one twice because there's just a lot here. Next time, maybe listen to this one with a pen in hand, because I just think there's a lot of self-reflection that can happen because of this episode that can really, truly be life transformative. And I know, if you're a young person, maybe looking at me and be like, well, okay, that's so lame, or that's so cheesy. It's actually, maybe it is, who cares, but it's actually true. So yes, I'm telling you that this can be a moment that you can remember the rest of your lives if you can find a way to really tap into some of these stabilizing thoughts. I think these thoughts that we talked about today are stabilizing. And I think that's really helpful as you think about your life as a human, beyond high school, beyond college. There's so much good. I love how you talked about you are enough. And we need to kind of take some time to think through that or journal through that, because that's a hard thing to process. Most of us don't feel like enough in life, just naturally. So if that's you, put in the time to go through this and ask yourself some hard questions and figure out those 3 to 5 things that you value most in life, and start, thinking through everything through the lens of those values that you hold most dear.
Yeah. And the last thing, one really quick thing too, is if you need to be reminded that, make sure you know who your champions are in your life, the people around you that give you that voice, that do recognize that value of who you are, and reach out to them and talk to them. And this is really a critical point, because I think sometimes we pull in instead of really reaching out. And so I would just encourage you to reach out and be reminded of that worth. And so that's also really, I think those relationships are really important for that. So
I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's a great way to end this discussion. Thanks for adding that in. Appreciate your time today, Dr. Holtberg.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.